Well, after all the designing, after all the building, it's finally time to start putting some data into the database. So we're going to start in this lecture with looking at the insert statement and the kinds of varieties of the insert statement. It is the fundamental building block that will lead us later to bulk loading of data into the database. So let's get started. All right, well, of all the ways to get data into the database, and we'll see a few as we go along, the most basic, most foundational way to get data into a database is with an insert statement. Later, we'll bundle a whole bunch of them together and we'll put them all in a giant document. But for now, we're just going to look at the insert statement by itself as we're doing inputting data one record at a time. Now, in general, there are two different kinds of flavors or varieties of the insert statement, and we'll look at both of those in this lecture. But I'm also going to show you a bunch of errors because the insert statement, probably more than any other, is the one that will generate MySQL errors. And it's just helpful for you to see some of those errors so that you know what's happening and how to fix them. In general, though, an insert statement looks something like this. And so this is our old friend from one of the original introductory lectures that has a terrible design, but ignore that for the moment. So let's say we want to insert a new row here into number of pets. We use the insert into statement. And so here's what that statement looks like down here at the bottom. And so I want to insert into the number of pets these columns, right? The columns ID, name, and pets. And into those columns, I would like to insert the following values, right? 4, Sarah, and 1. The insert statement then has this kind of repetitive structure, right? It's always going to be insert into table, blah, 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 values, blah, 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 blah. So that's the structure that you're going to see over and over and over again. And that's what that looks like when the data gets inserted. We have that new row with those values. What we're going to do is look at the citing table, especially in Bird Club. And just as a reminder, here's what that table looks like. Now, you might be playing with a version that has a primary key ID column in there, and that's fine. For the sake of this exercise, I'm not going to use that version of it, but we'll talk as we go along about how to insert primary keys. And so you'll see this describe kind of diagram of citing in person. We'll see that as we go through this lecture. But generally, we're going to look at two versions of the insert statement. And I'll repeat this at the end, but the first one is going to explicitly list both the columns that we're using and the data that goes into those columns. That's a version like we just saw in that last slide. There's a second one that's a little more risky, a little more technically sophisticated, and can go sideways on you a little more, which is that we're only going to list the data, and then we will implicitly assume the columns in the column order, but we'll see that one here in just a minute. So what we're doing then is, just like we saw in that last slide of the slide before, is that we're going to first list the columns into which we want to put data, and then we will list the data that goes into those columns. So here in the middle of the screen here, we've got an insert statement that we're going to work with. But there are several things that you should notice, I guess, about this. The first one is that I do need to list the table into which the data will be inserted. I mean, that's probably commonsensical, but I can't tell you the number of times I forget to tell MySQL which table I want to work with, so we always have to list the table. The second thing is, coming out of data types, we know that the two basic data types for MySQL are going to be numbers and strings. Now, that last bit of data is a date. And remember the citing table, that third column is a date column. And you'll notice that I'm treating that date as if it's a string. And that makes some sense, right? Because we don't want MySQL to think of that as 2011 minus 9 minus 30 and then to do the math on that. So what we do is we hand off to MySQL a string that is in a proper date format, and MySQL will take that and convert it into its own internal structure of a date. And then that date will be amenable or usable to all of those really spiffy, fun date and time functions that MySQL has. You'll notice too that I don't need to put quotation marks around numbers. So unless I specify otherwise, MySQL assumes that something should be a number. And you'll notice too, as well, that both the columns and the data are parenthesized lists. So their column is separated inside, but they go inside parentheses as well. And the thing about this one is, the thing about insert, is that the listing order of the columns matches the listing order of the data. So in other words, if I turn this blue here, I don't know, it's kind of hard to see maybe. So person ID is the first column listed in that group, and so it will get the first value in the data value group. Bird ID is the second column listed, and so it will get the second value in the value list. And then obviously date is the third column, and so it will get the third data value. So they go in order in that way. And that's one of the really important things to remember and to work out when we're working on the insert statement. Now, the cool thing about that is that as long as I pair up the columns with the proper data values, I don't need to list them in order as they appear in the table. So here, for example, I have insert into citing bird and date and person. Now that's not the order they occur in the table. And I've just moved the values over a little bit so you can see how that pairs up a little better. So 2 is going to go into the bird ID column. That date, 2011 October 10, is going to go into the date field, which is number 2. And then 4 is going to go into the person ID column. Now, that's totally fine. MySQL can figure that out. So those columns do not need to be in the proper order. One of the errors that you will probably encounter eventually is when we mismatch the number of columns to the number of data values. So in this query, insert into citing, I've listed 3 columns, right? Person, bird, date, but I have only given MySQL 1 value. And so it says, hey, your column count doesn't match the value count. And that's the gist or the heart and soul of this particular kind of an error. So the column count is 3, there are 3 columns, and the value count is 1. There's only 1 data value there. So that's why I get that particular kind of an error. So obviously 3 data columns, but 1 data value. So that's where my error is going to come from. Now, as long as my column count matches my data count, I don't need to do every column in the table. So here, for example, I'm inserting into the citing table only the person and the bird, and those are values 4 and 12. So in this version, I have omitted or skipped the date column. Now, if I look at the description down here, which is at the bottom, you'll notice that the date column can in fact be null, right? Under the null column there it says yes, and under the default column it says null. So if I insert into citing person ID and bird, values 4 and 12, I am not inserting anything into the date column, and it will in fact be null in this circumstance. Now, had I defined the citing table differently so that date could not be null, then I would get an error. But because it is allowed to be null here, this insertion works just fine. Now here's a second technique. This one is a little bit bolder and it can go sideways on you in some pretty awful ways, but let's just take a look. So here's my my query. So I'm inserting into citing. Notice there's no column and the values 1, 2, and a particular date. And you'll notice that that query was okay. It says 1 row affected. And again, the reason that that one works is that although I am not listing the columns, there are 3 columns in that table: person ID, bird ID, and date. And so these 3 values match the 3 columns in the table in exactly the order in which they appear in the table. So I am not double checking or confirming that there is a pairwise match between columns. I'm just assuming implicitly that the values that I have will be correct and in the correct order. And that seems to be fine. But you can see down at the bottom here that if I get the number of data items wrong, I get an error, and I get a familiar error. So here I'm inserting into citing, but I'm not listing any columns. So MySQL says, okay, you must give me a value for every column in that table in exactly the same order in which it appears. But there are 3 columns, and here I've only given it 2 values. So the error message here may seem a bit counterintuitive, but I hope you can figure it out, which is that the column count doesn't match the value count. And at first you're saying, well, look, I didn't give you any columns. So where did a column count come from? Well, the column count came from MySQL looking at that table and noticing that there are 3 columns. So it's trying to count 3 against the values that you've given it, which are 2. And of course, 3 doesn't match 2, so we get an error message. Here's another way in which this insert can go sideways for us. As I just mentioned, we have to give the data in exactly the same order in which the columns appear in the table. So now if I goof that up and I get my columns out of order, I am going to, one of 2 things is going to happen. In the newer versions of MySQL, it will notice probably that I have some sort of a mistake and it'll error out here. So in this one, for example, the first column is person_ID. The type of that column is that it is a tiny int unsigned, which means that it has to be an integer no bigger than 255. So I'm obviously here inserting a string, a date, which is incorrect, into an integer column. And so what happens is it takes the binary digits of 2011-09-28, whatever those binary digits are, it pretends that that is really an integer. Whatever that number is going to come out to be, I have no idea, but it's going to be pretty big. And so what we get is an error message that says that person ID is out of range. So when it converts that string into an integer, it actually creates a number that's bigger than 255, and so I get an out of range error. And now that's in the new versions of MySQL. In an old version of MySQL, you might get this problem, so I wanted to point this one out to you in case this is something that you might see. In this case, in an older version of MySQL, it takes that string, 2011-09-28, and it tries to jam it into the person ID column as best as it can. And in this case, it maxes out at 255 because that's the biggest number that I can put into a tiny int column. So what happens here is that it takes that string, it looks at a tiny int, and it just says, well, the biggest number I can put in is 255. I have a way bigger number, so I'm just going to put in 255, right? And then what happens is the second data item, which is just the number 1, the integer 1, goes into bird ID, which is also a tiny int. Does the number 1 fit into a tiny int? Sure does, absolutely. So that goes in just fine. And then the third one is weird because now I have the number 3, but I'm trying to put the number 3 into a date column. So what happens is that MySQL says, okay, well, I guess that's 0000 for the year, or here, 2000. And then I don't know the month, so I guess that's 00, but then the day must be 03. So I get an unknown month. I get the third day of an unknown month in the year 2000, and that's what I get for that. So in an older version of MySQL, that might show up too. So one of the tricks to look for here is, after you insert, kind of do a sanity check on your data and look at it. And if you have a whole bunch of things like 255, 255, 255, 255, that should be a sign to you that you're maxing out a tiny int column and that something probably has gone wrong there. And by the same token, if you did not want to put a lot of zeros into your dates, but you suddenly have a lot of zeros in your dates, that's a little suspicious too, right? So go back and check and double check that your data columns and the data values are actually paired up properly in your query. All right, let's just talk a little bit about inserting primary keys here. Here's the person table. So we get first, last, email, phone, obviously, and then we have an ID, which is a primary key. It's a tiny int unsigned, so 1 to 255. Can we put null into that? Nope, we can't. That's disallowed. Is it a key? Yep, primary key, and it is an auto increment column. So here's my query. I'm just going to insert into 3 columns. That's all I'm going to insert into. And so I'm leaving out email and phone. Both of those are null, so that's okay. Don't worry about that. So I'm going to insert into person ID, first and last, only those 3 columns, the following values, null and Deb and Jones. And at first you say, well, hey, wait a second. You told me that the ID column can't be null, and yet we're putting null into it. Well, this is one of the places where MySQL figures out something better to do than what we told it. Namely, because this is an integer column and it's auto increment, null is disallowed. So what MySQL does is it goes and it calculates the next auto increment number, and it uses that in the ID column. So I don't even need to go look up what the largest value is in the ID column. I don't care. I'm just telling MySQL, go get the next one and put it in there. Now, here's a little caution. This really only works with integers. So the auto increments are a little bit tricky. So this works really, really well with integers and less well with other kinds of values. But that's okay. All right, so that's one way. So I can, in fact, here's the lesson of the slide. I can, in fact, put null into an ID primary key column, it's, at least if it's an integer with an auto increment, because MySQL will figure out what goes in there. Now, the second way that I can do this is actually ignore the ID column entirely. And I do both of these techniques, but this one I think works pretty well. So here I'm inserting into person only 2 columns, first and last, ignoring email and phone, and in this one, ignoring ID. And into first and last, I'm just inserting Deb and Jones. So now I haven't made any mistakes, but MySQL does the same thing. Because that ID column is an integer and because it's auto increment, it just goes and it gets the next value and puts it in for me automatically. And that's totally fine. So here's the trick. If you list the ID column or the primary key, just stick null in there and it will go find the next value. Or if you want to be maybe a little cleaner about it in your insert statement, just ignore the primary key column and let MySQL figure out what goes in there. Now, if you need to know what's in there, what you can do is select the last insert ID, and MySQL will tell you what number just went into the primary key column there. Now, you have to do that immediately. You can't kind of keep doing that to go backwards and find other ones. So if you need to know the last insert ID, and sometimes you do, we'll see a couple of reasons in a lecture coming up where you would need that. Bulk loading is a good example. So if you need to know what that last insert ID is, you can find that. Well, let's spend a little bit of time with strings. Strings, when we're doing insertions, are going to be the bane of your existence. I'm sorry to say that. So let's just figure out a few strategies to use when we work with strings. So let's say that we're doing, famous quotations. And, here's one of the most famous quotations in world history. I don't like peas. So let's say that we want to insert that string into a column in some sort of a table. We might get exactly this kind of a problem. So I'm going to insert into this table. This is an invented. I use delete me a lot or del me. These are all things that I can delete later, but it doesn't matter. Okay, insert into this table del me Values, I don't like P's, and you'll see, of course, that is a string, and so I have wrapped it in quotation marks dutifully, like I ought to, and then I put in my semicolon, but I get this weird second line prompt with a quotation mark and then my arrow. And what happens, and you probably have guessed this, is that MySQL thinks that I am in the middle of a quotation. It thinks that I'm in the middle of a string. So it's dutifully waiting for me, patiently saying, dude, look, I know you're in the middle of a string. I'm just going to wait, hang out. I'm going to give you this cool second line prompt, by the way, just to remind you that you're in the middle of a string, because you're in the middle of a string. So I've obviously goofed this up, so I need to get out of this. So here's what I do. I can cancel my query with a \c, but I have to type the closing quotation mark first. So I put this down here in red so that you can see it pretty clearly. So when this happens, I need to cancel that query and just start over. But I am in the middle of a string, and MySQL thinks that anything is legit. Semicolons are legit, new line characters are legit, \c is legit, everything is legit inside a string. So what I have to tell MySQL is, you're not in a string anymore, and please cancel. And that's what we use. So I type my quotation mark and then \c. Okay, now the reason I got here is because there are actually 3 quotation marks there, and MySQL is waiting for the 4th. So the first quote opens a new string, which is I space DON. And then the apostrophe in don't closes the string. So the string is done. Then it thinks T, like, P's, period, is perhaps some kind of weird SQL. Now, it's not going to get far enough down the path to try to interpret that as SQL, because before it can do that, it sees this third quotation mark, which opens a string. And the new string is right-hand parenthesis, semicolon, new line. So that's where we are. That's where we're sitting. So we need to solve this problem, and there are 2 classic ways to do it. Well, here's number 1, and I'm going to tell you this is not the best way to do it, but you can do it, which is, if that apostrophe is a single quotation mark, then you just use double quotation marks on the outside, right? So inserting values double quotes, I don't like P's double quotes, problem solved. Does that work? Yep, absolutely, totally fine. I got double quotes on the front, double quotes on the back, totally great. Farther down the line, what happens if you're using a novel quotation where you've got apostrophes and people speaking with double quotes? If that's the case, now you've got a new problem. So we'll go into version 2. This is called escaping that single quote. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put quotation mark IDON, and then I'm going to put a \, in front of the apostrophe. Now, normally that single quotation mark is kind of like a meta character. It's a special character. It's not part of the string, but it tells MySQL where the string begins and ends. So they're superhero quotation marks. What the \ does is to tell MySQL this is not a meta character. It is not a superhero character. It's not a superhero quotation mark. It is a mere mortal quotation mark. So do not let it end the end of a string. Don't let it terminate a string, because there's nothing special about it. So this is actually the better way to do it, is to escape those characters. Now, when we get a little farther down to another lecture, farther down the line, and we start inserting data with Python, Python can handle this for us automatically so that we don't have to do it. But in the meantime, we might have to do some of this escaping or backslashing on our own. So you'll see both of those. The better one is going to be the bottom one, because you can \ both single quotes and double quotes at the same time, and so that's going to save you. Okay. Yeah, there it is. Always remember where you put your animations. It's right there. All right. Now let's just talk a little bit about default values. We've seen in the describe of the table, when we're describing a table, that we can have default values in there. But we can define those ourselves. And so I just wanted to show you what that looks like. So here's another table, del me, delete me, you can throw it away later. And I've got two columns here. I've got num and str. The num is going to be an integer, but what I'm telling MySQL is that if I do not insert any data into the num column, that MySQL should put the number 7 in there. Why 7? I don't know. I just made this up. The second column is string. It's a varchar 10, but I'm telling MySQL that if I do not give it any data for that value, it should insert the string yoip. Right? So both of these now have default values. And so when I insert, if I leave out one or the other, even both actually, of those values, MySQL knows what to put in there. So when I start to insert values, we'll get something like this. So I'm going to insert into delme the values 1 and crikey. Now, both of those are values, right? Again, I'm leaving the columns out. So I have to give data for each column in exactly the right order. That's what I've done. So 1 goes into the num column, crikey goes into the str column. Now if I do it again, I'm inserting into the num column the value 2, but I have not inserted anything into str. So str gets the default value of yoip, right there. Let's do a third one. If I insert into that column, but only the str column, insert into that table the str column, I'm going to put in the value hello, but I do not have a value for the num column, so that will take the value 7 automatically. Right there. Perfect. So these are really great ways that you can define what's going to happen in a table. Where would we use that? Well, here's a good one that we talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about the structure of the bird club table, and we talked about deletes and how difficult deletes are. And we suggested that maybe one of the solutions, instead of deleting a person, is actually in the person table to tell MySQL, or have MySQL tell us, whether they are currently an active member of bird club or not. And if I define the table slightly differently than we did before, I can do that. So I can put a column at the end called active. I capitalized that, shouldn't have been. Okay, I can put a column in the end called active, and it is an enumerated list. It can only take 2 values, yes or no. That's it. But the default value is yes. And so what that means is when somebody signs up for Bird Club, we will not insert anything into the ID column because it's an auto increment, so we skip that one. We'll put in their first name, their last name. If they have an email and a phone, we'll put that in as well. And then we will skip the active column because it will take the answer yes. They are automatically, by virtue of signing up, an active member of Bird Club. Later, when they move to Tatooine or wherever they're going to move to, all we have to do to delete them, instead of deleting them, is we come in here and we just update the table, and we set the column called active to be no, where the ID is 1. Now, this is how enum columns work, and for those of you who have some computer background, you're probably going crazy now because you want this to be a bit. It's either a 1 or a 0. So for those of you who are a little worried about this right now, yes, that is how MySQL stores this. It stores this as a series of bits, and then it has a little lookup table. So it is not, in fact, taking up 3 bytes of data to store yes. It's only using 1 bit, believe it or not, in that. So, okay. So if you're in the computer stuff and you're worried about that, don't be. All right. So here's what I want to do next. In the last video, where we were creating a database, we created one for our books, and we have these 3 columns in there. So let's just flip over into the terminal window right now, and we'll just do some inserts on this table structure. All right, here we are on the desktop, full of chaos. So What I'd like to do is to insert these two books into our books database. One of them is this Definitive Guide to MySQL by Paul Du Bois. By the way, best writer on MySQL. If Paul Du Bois says it, it's true. So I've collected some data here in my document. You can see this. I've just copied it from Amazon, to be honest. But you can get it from a library. You can get it from anywhere. So that's one book we're going to put in. The second book we're going to put in, well, actually the first one, is this one, Headfirst PHP and MySQL. And you'll notice two things. Number one, it has two authors, Lynn Bailey and Mike Morsland. So we're going to have to put two authors in for that. And the publisher here is O'Reilly with a very problematic apostrophe right there. So we'll fix that as well as we go along. Up top here, I just put the diagram for our database so that we remember what's in there, what it looks like. That's a handy thing to have when we're writing queries. Here's just a plain text document. I happen to be using BB Edit today, but you can use anything you want to. And I copy and paste some of that information. Again, I got this from Amazon, but I could get it from the library. I could even do it from the books, pull it down off my bookshelf and just copy it out by hand. That's fine. Here I have my terminal window all ready to go. I've just gotten into MySQL, but I haven't told it which database I want to do yet. So I'm going to say use books. And if I want to show tables, there you go. There are the three tables that we have created. Now, what I do typically when I'm working with inserts, I can type them right here in the terminal window, but I am not the world's greatest typer, and if the data gets really long, like it will for the book table, for example, I can't necessarily go back and fix it easily. So what I often do is open a plain text document and create some templates. So the first three templates here are inserting data into the person table. So what I'm just going to do is copy information from up here on people and paste it into the template. And then I've got three insert queries ready to go. The second set are books. And so one of the things you'll notice is that I am not listing all of the columns in the book table. And what that means is that I have to insert the correct number of data items, and those data items must be in the correct order. So null goes into the ID column. I can't skip the ID column. You'll notice on the person table, I did skip the ID column because I'm listing only first and last. But here, I'm not listing any columns at all. So I have to do all of them, what are those, 6? I have to do 6 data items, and I have to do them in the correct order. And then finally, down here is the role table. And I'm going to do that one last because it involves foreign keys. And you'll notice I am again skipping the ID column, and I'm going straight to person ID, book ID, and role. Now, all of these people are going to be authors. And so we'll take a look at the enumerated list of role here in just a second. But author is one of the 3 allowable values in that column. And then I just skipped ahead so I can show you what this looks like. I just copy that data in. So this is a legitimate insert query. And in fact, all 3 of these are legitimate insert queries. So what I can do is I'm just going to copy all 3 of them in one fell swoop because I feel pretty bold, right? So I'm just going to go under Edit, and I'm going to copy those. And I'm going to come over here, and if I do a select star from person, you'll notice I don't have any people in there. It's an empty set. So now all I'm going to do is paste all of those queries. You'll see that because some of them I have copied and pasted the return key, that those 2, the first 2 did in fact get inserted into the database. The third one, I did not end up copying a return key, so I have to hit return right now, and now it's in. So if I do select star from person again, now I've got 3 people in the database. So let me just go down and go back to my document over here, and I'm just going to go down to books. So here I've entered null for the primary key. I have a title. I have a town. I'm just guessing that's Sebastopol. I can't ever spell Sebastopol. Now, here's the problematic one, right? This one is done by O'Reilly Media, and you'll see there's that problematic apostrophe right there. Now, I have used double quotes, so I will not have a problem, but we talked about the other technique, which is to use single quotes. Now I need to escape that problematic apostrophe, and I'm going to go over here and turn this one back into a single quote. So now this is a single quoted string, but the apostrophe has been escaped, so it is no longer a meta character, it is just a mere mortal character. The other thing that I was worried about, there were two things that I'm a little worried about. One is how long this is. So I'm just going to copy that quick. And you'll notice in the diagram here, I had designed that ISBN column as 13, but I made it bigger. I made it 16 because the ISBN has 13 characters plus some optional hyphens. So I want to know how long that is. So what I can do is I can just select the length. I think I copied the quotes. So that's 14 characters long, which is going to be fine. You'll notice that the title, I have 150 characters. Well, that should be completely fine as well. I just want to do a quick check here just to make sure that this fits in there. So I can't spell select, so I'm going to select the length of that title, and that's only 46 characters long. So I'm good to go. All right. So I'm just going to look at this over, insert into book, right? No columns. So I need 6 data entry items here, plus the null at the top for the ID. Insert null, MySQL, Boston, etc., etc. Okay, that looks good. So I'm just going to copy these. Copy. That blank line will not matter at all. And then I'm going to go paste. I'll do the menu one instead of the key shortcut. Paste. There you go. So that query was okay. One row is affected. That query is okay. One row affected. And now if I do select star from book, and you see it wraps around goofy. So here's what I'm going to do. This doesn't fit anywhere necessarily in the lectures. It just comes up when it comes up. I'm going to take out that semicolon. The semicolon is the same as a \lower g, by the way. But if I do \uppercase G, I get a much better output. So this, if I have things that wrap around, just end your query with \uppercase G. And so you can see everything goes in here fine. ID 1, head first PHP MySQL, ID 2, MySQL, etc., etc. Great. All right. Now the last one is the role table. And so there's going to be an ID here, which I'm not going to worry about. It's auto increment. I'm going to let I'm going to let MySQL figure that out on its own. So we have to insert the foreign keys about person ID and book ID. Now, MySQL is not capable of going and looking in another table to retrieve the primary key. If I needed to do that, I can do that with a scripting language or something like that. But if I just say, hey, insert where the title is this, etc. Now, technically, if you know subqueries, I could do it. I'm going to do a lot of work with foreign keys in the bulk loading video. I'm going to give you a couple of different techniques to handle this foreign key stuff. For right now, I just have to do it manually. And so what that means is I just need to go in, select star from person, and I just need to either copy out or pay attention to these primary keys. So book number 1 is authored by person number 1 and person number 2. Book number 2 is authored by person number 3. And so I make that shortcut right here. So I use the template for the insert query, and I just grab those foreign keys. And you'll notice I am listing the columns, and I have ignored the primary key column. So MySQL will fill that in automatically. So person ID is going to be 1, book ID is 1, and their role is author. Here in the role column, you'll see that we designed that as an enumerated list. So there are really only 3 possible values that I can put in there: author, editor, illustrator, or null. It's possible that that role could be null. I can't put anything else in there. So like producer or director or actor, none of those are legal values in that column. And if I try to insert something else like actor or reader or something like that, I'm going to get an error. So this provides me a bit of data integrity. I need to make sure that I spell it properly, so sometimes you might want to copy and paste that out, which I've done here. And so again, person number 1 wrote book 1, person 2 wrote book 1, etc. So if I copy these, come over and paste, paste. All right, there you go. And again, the first 2 queries, I copied the return key at the end, or the new line character, but the 3rd query I did not, so that just leaves it to me to hit return, and that's all okay. And so now if I do select star from, what is it, role, there you go. I have my primary keys, they're automatically inserted. Person 1 wrote book 1, person 2 wrote book 1, etc., etc. So all my data is in there. Now again, just to repeat, in the bulk loading video, I'm going to talk a lot more about how to work with these foreign keys. This is one of the sticky parts about getting data into the database. But if I'm just doing it piecemeal, like here I was only working on 2 books at a time, then I can kind of do this manually. I can eyeball it and I can get those foreign keys in there properly. All right, well, that's it today for the insert statements. Thanks very much.